Welcome to the Puzzle Proof, where mysteries begin. Every clue is a deception. Every answer leads to more questions. Only the sharpest minds will see the truth hiding in plain sight. Miss Marple and the Last Rose of Oakwood Manor, Chapter 1. A Tragic Discovery. The afternoon sun cast its warm golden glow over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a serene, almost idyllic light. The hustle and bustle of everyday life seemed far removed from the kind of events that might stir the small, peaceful village into anything resembling excitement. It was a place where gossip moved slowly, as if it too were reluctant to disrupt the quiet harmony of the countryside. But that all changed on the day tragedy struck Oakwood Manor. The Bennet family had long been a fixture of the village, their names synonymous with respectability and propriety. The elder Mr. and Mrs. Bennet were known for their generosity, their large, immaculately maintained estate, and their two children, Thomas, a somewhat handsome but aloof young man, and Elizabeth, their youngest daughter. Elizabeth was a bright, vivacious girl, the very picture of youth and innocence. But it was Elizabeth's passion for the garden at Oakwood Manor that had drawn the most attention in recent years. She had a particular fondness for the roses, especially the red ones, which were rumoured to be her favourite. On this particular day, it was the roses that would play a role in a tragedy none of the villagers could have foreseen. It was just past 2 in the afternoon when a local maid, Mary, was sent to fetch Elizabeth for tea. As she approached the garden, she noticed the young girl sitting in her usual spot among the rose bushes. Elizabeth had always found solace there, enveloped by the blooms, their delicate petals a comfort to her, their fragrance an indulgence. But as Mary drew closer, a strange stillness hung in the air, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw the lifeless form of Elizabeth slumped against the flower bed. At first, Mary thought the girl was simply resting, perhaps overcome by the heat of the afternoon. But as she stepped forward, she realized with mounting horror that Elizabeth was not asleep, nor simply resting. She was dead. The maid's scream shattered the silence of the garden, and within moments Mr. Bennet and the rest of the household rushed outside. Mrs. Bennet, upon seeing her daughter, let out a cry of disbelief. Her beloved Elizabeth lay motionless, her body untouched by any sign of harm. But what caught everyone's eye, and what would soon become the focal point of the investigation, was the red rose still gripped tightly in Elizabeth's hand. The rose, perfectly formed and freshly bloomed, seemed so innocuous, so unremarkable, and yet it held within it the key to the most puzzling of deaths. Elizabeth's face was serene, as if she had simply drifted into an eternal slumber. There was no struggle, no sign of violence, nothing to suggest that anyone had harmed her in any way. But still the rose remained, clutched in her fingers, a strange symbol of the mystery that was about to unfold. As the police arrived and began their investigation, they found no immediate signs of foul play, no footprints, no broken windows, and no witnesses to suggest that anyone had entered the garden or approached Elizabeth in any way. And yet the cause of death was undeniable. Elizabeth had died far too suddenly, and it was evident that something had taken place within the quiet confines of the garden to end her life so abruptly. It was the fragrance of the rose that soon caught the attention of the officers. The flowers, so carefully tended by the gardener, Mr. Alistair James, emitted a sweet, almost intoxicating scent. But upon closer inspection it was revealed that the fragrance of the rose had been tainted, no longer a pure, natural perfume, but something far darker and more sinister. Tests conducted later confirmed that the flower had been poisoned, and Elizabeth had inhaled the deadly fumes as she had so often done in the past. The police were baffled. They had seen their fair share of deaths, but never one quite like this. How had the poison come to be on the flower, and why? The gardeners had always been careful with the roses, and the flowers were regularly inspected for any signs of disease or decay. There was no logical explanation for why this particular rose, out of all the others, had been tainted. The idea that someone had poisoned it, deliberately and with intent, seemed too calculated, too cold-blooded to be plausible. But there was no other explanation. Mr. Alistair James, the gardener, was called in for questioning. He was a quiet man, reserved and dependable, someone who had worked for the Bennets for many years. It seemed unthinkable that he would have any involvement in such a crime, but his access to the garden and its plants made him a person of interest. "I take great care with the roses, sir," James explained nervously when questioned by the police. "I have worked with them for years, and I know each plant like the back of my hand. I would never harm them, or anyone." Despite his assurances, there was something unsettling in his manner, though it was impossible to put a finger on it. Perhaps it was simply the shock of the moment, or perhaps the knowledge that something terrible had happened under his watch. The police continued their investigation, but the more they probed, the less they seemed to understand. There were no clear motives, no clear suspects, and no obvious answers. The garden was pristine, the roses carefully tended, with not a petal out of place, except for the one that had killed Elizabeth. And that was the most puzzling part of it all. The village, once calm and composed, now buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that only a death like this could bring. Rumors swirled, but the truth remained elusive. As the police continued their work, one thing was certain: this was no ordinary crime. And somewhere, in the midst of this tragedy, there was a murderer, a person who had carefully orchestrated a death so quiet, so subtle, that no one could have imagined it possible. But Miss Marple, with her quiet observation and sharp eye for detail, would soon arrive in St. Mary Mead, and she would bring with her the keen insight that had solved so many mysteries before. As the villagers held their breath and the police conducted their inquiries, Miss Marple was already quietly piecing together the puzzle in her mind. Chapter 2. Miss Marple arrives. The news of Elizabeth Bennet's death spread quickly through the small, tight-knit village of St. Mary Mead. A sense of unease gripped the villagers, and though the tragedy had occurred at Oakwood Manor, it was as if the event had touched every corner of the village. There was no question that this was a matter that required attention beyond the capabilities of the local constables. The name Miss Jane Marple, quiet and unassuming as it was, would soon rise to the forefront of the discussion. Miss Marple was not often seen at the social gatherings or village events that punctuated life in St. Mary Mead, but when it came to matters of the mind, matters of observation, human nature, and the quiet deceit that often accompanied tragedy, she was a formidable force. Her quiet presence and unassuming manner belied a sharpness that made her the best kind of detective, the kind who noticed the things others missed, the kind who understood the complexities of people without needing to say a word. Her reputation for solving mysteries, especially those that baffled the local authorities, was well established. When the tragedy struck, it was no surprise that the villagers immediately turned to Miss Marple. In the small drawing room of her cosy cottage, she received a discreet note from Mrs. Bennet, imploring her to come at once. The note was filled with sorrowful words, but Miss Marple could detect an underlying tone, a sense of urgency that hinted at more than just grief. And so, on the following morning, Miss Marple set out for Oakwood Manor, her pace measured, her eyes alert to every detail. The house stood as it always had, large, imposing, and meticulously maintained. But today there was an unmistakable chill in the air, a solemnity that even the most perfectly pruned garden could not disguise. Upon her arrival, Miss Marple was greeted by Mrs. Bennet, whose grief was almost palpable. Her face, normally composed, was now contorted in sorrow. The deep lines of worry that had marked her face over the years seemed even more pronounced in the wake of her daughter's death. As she clasped Miss Marple's hands in hers, the older woman seemed to collapse into the chair by the hearth, her voice breaking with every word. "Oh, Miss Marple, what am I to do? My Elizabeth, my darling girl, taken so suddenly, so horribly. How could this have happened?" Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her eyes taking in every detail. The woman's distress was genuine, but Miss Marple's mind was already moving swiftly. Grief, of course, was natural, but there was something in Mrs. Bennet's eyes, something buried deep beneath the surface, that Miss Marple was not quite prepared to identify yet. Mr. Bennet, who had been sitting silently by the window, appeared to have retreated into his own thoughts. His eyes were distant, fixed on something far away, though nothing could be seen through the fogged-up glass. Miss Marple's keen observation noted the lack of outward emotion. It was not that he was unaffected. His very stillness suggested that he was processing something too deeply to express outwardly. Or perhaps, she mused, he was simply detached. His gaze never quite met anyone else's. Their son Thomas entered the room shortly after Miss Marple's arrival. His tall frame and neat attire gave him an air of confidence, but Miss Marple noted the flicker of discomfort that crossed his face as he approached. There was an odd tension in his manner, an unease that suggested that his mind was preoccupied with something other than the tragedy at hand. As he spoke, his voice was sharp, almost brittle.
"I can't believe this has happened," Thomas said, his words strained. "It's simply dreadful, of course, but the scandal, the implications—" He trailed off, and Miss Marple's sharp eye caught the way he glanced towards the windows, as if gauging how his words might be received by the others in the room. His concern for the scandal was obvious, though he made a half-hearted attempt to mask it as concern for his sister.
Finally, there was Charlotte. The younger daughter was sitting in the far corner, her face hidden behind a veil of dark hair. Miss Marple had met Charlotte only briefly in passing before, and it struck her as curious that the girl, though clearly distraught, seemed oddly composed, her grief contained, even controlled. She was the least demonstrative of the family, and Miss Marple had a feeling that this was not the first time Charlotte had concealed her emotions. But today, something seemed to break in the girl's carefully constructed facade. As she looked up at Miss Marple, her eyes were red-rimmed, and her voice trembled with the weight of unspoken sorrow.
"I loved her so much," Charlotte whispered. I
don't know who would do something like this." Miss Marple observed her for a moment longer, before speaking gently. "I am sure that in time we will understand what has happened here, Miss Charlotte, but it is important that we approach this with calmness, for your sake, for your family's sake." With her usual tact, Miss Marple offered no judgments, no opinions, only the quiet assurance that she would do what she could to uncover the truth. The family members, though each with their own reactions to the tragedy, had no reason to suspect Miss Marple's careful watchfulness. As the conversation continued, Miss Marple politely excused herself with a promise to return shortly. Her quiet presence had begun to make its mark, and she moved outside toward the garden where Elizabeth had spent so many hours. The air was still, though the sense of tension had not lifted. Miss Marple walked slowly among the rows of roses, her eyes scanning the garden with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime observing the small, often unnoticed, details of life. As she approached the spot where Elizabeth had fallen, she noticed the absence of any sign of a struggle, no broken stems, no disturbed earth. But something was off. It was not just the roses, so carefully tended, but the very stillness of the place. Something, she felt, was lurking beneath the surface, and it would not remain hidden for long. Chapter 3. The Garden of Secrets. The garden at Oakwood Manor was undoubtedly one of the finest in St. Mary Mead. A true reflection of Mrs. Bennet's devotion to her home, it was a place where every flower, every shrub, was chosen with care and tended to with the precision of a true enthusiast. Mrs. Bennet spoke often of her garden, often with more affection than she showed to her own children, and Elizabeth, the youngest of the Bennet children, was known to be her mother's most enthusiastic companion in cultivating the various flowers. Roses, especially, were a particular passion of Elizabeth's. Her fondness for the blooms was well known, and she often spent hours amongst them, inhaling their sweet scent, or speaking to them softly, as if they might offer her wisdom in return. It was amidst this sea of carefully nurtured flowers that Elizabeth had met her untimely death. The garden, which had once been a place of joy and peace, now seemed heavy with an air of foreboding. Miss Marple, as always, approached the scene with her usual calm and patience, determined to find the truth in the details that others might overlook. As she walked through the garden, Miss Marple couldn't help but admire its beauty. Yet, as always, her sharp eyes missed nothing. The rows of roses, with their soft colours and delicate petals, were carefully arranged, each bloom standing proud and perfect. And yet, there, among them, was one rose that caught her attention. It was darker than the others, almost unnaturally so, and its petals were fuller, almost as though it had been altered in some way. Miss Marple paused, crouching low to inspect the flower more closely. The rose was a deep shade of crimson, but there was something not quite right about its appearance. The edges of the petals seemed unusually smooth, the colour deeper and richer than the surrounding blooms. It was as though this particular rose had been nurtured more than the others, coaxed into a vibrancy that didn't seem to belong in a garden that prided itself on balance and natural beauty. Miss Marple's instinct told her that this was the flower Elizabeth had been drawn to, the one she had admired so much in her final moments. Her fingers brushed the stem gently as she examined the flower, and as she did, she noticed a faint residue of something, an oily substance, on the petals. It was subtle, but it was there. This was no mere natural bloom. Someone had tampered with it. The poison that had claimed Elizabeth's life had not come from nature, but from the hands of someone who knew how to use it. Miss Marple rose from her crouch and looked around the garden once more. It was immaculate, each path swept clean, each plant in perfect order. But as she made her way towards the garden shed at the far end of the property, she noticed a familiar figure standing near the tool shed. Mr. Alastair James, the gardener, was watching her with a gaze that seemed far too intent, too focused for one simply tending to his duties. "Mr. James," Miss Marple said, her tone polite but firm, "I trust the roses are as healthy as ever?" The gardener gave a start, as if startled by her sudden approach. "Ah, Miss Marple, yes, ma'am, they're in fine shape," he said, his voice a little too hurried. "I've seen to them all with the utmost care. I take great pride in my work, I do." Miss Marple noted his nervousness, the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his cap. There was something about his posture that suggested he was trying to hide something. She smiled kindly, though her eyes remained fixed on him. "Of course," Miss Marple said gently, "but I understand that this particular rose, this deep crimson one, was very special to Elizabeth. She spent many hours in this garden, you know." The gardener seemed to stiffen at the mention of Elizabeth's name, and Miss Marple couldn't help but observe how his gaze dropped to the ground for a moment before he regained his composure. "Ah, yes, Miss Elizabeth," Mr. James said, his voice a little quieter. "She loved the roses. I always made sure she had the finest blooms, but sometimes—" He paused, seemingly uncertain. "Sometimes nature does things we cannot control. A flower like that, well, it grows beyond what you expect. It's the way of things." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, though she didn't interrupt him. She knew he was offering a convenient excuse, something to deflect suspicion. "Indeed," she said, her voice soft but thoughtful. "But I've noticed something unusual. The petals of this rose are not like the others. They are fuller, darker. Have you ever seen such a thing before?" The gardener seemed to hesitate, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. "Well, ma'am, roses can sometimes change in odd ways. The weather, the soil, you see, they all play a part. But I assure you there's no foul play here." Miss Marple studied him for a moment longer before nodding slowly. "Of course, Mr. James. Nature is often full of surprises." She smiled at him, but there was no mistaking the keen suspicion in her eyes. Miss Marple had learned long ago to trust her instincts, and in this case they were telling her that Mr. James was not as innocent as he appeared. Nature might have its mysteries, but Miss Marple suspected that this particular rose's transformation was no accident. With a polite nod, she excused herself and made her way back through the garden, her mind already beginning to piece together the puzzle. The rose, once a symbol of beauty and love, had become the instrument of death, and someone had made sure of that. Chapter 4. The Family's Web. Miss Marple stood in the grand sitting room of Oakwood Manor, quietly observing the family that had so recently been struck by tragedy. The room, with its rich furniture and soft fading light, seemed a strange contrast to the tension that hung in the air. The family was gathered together, the usually well-mannered Bennet household, now turned into a scene of quiet chaos. Each person reacted to the tragedy in their own way, but Miss Marple knew better than to take their grief at face value. The truth, as always, was often more complex than it appeared on the surface. Mrs. Bennet, the mother, was the most visibly distraught. Her face, normally composed and dignified, now showed the raw pain of a mother who had lost her only daughter. She sat at the head of the room, a handkerchief clutched tightly in her hands, dabbing at her eyes with rapid, almost frantic movements. Her sobs were soft but relentless, and as she looked at her husband and children, there was a sense of disbelief in her eyes, as though she could not quite accept the reality of what had happened. "She was my only daughter," Mrs. Bennet said, her voice breaking, as she turned to Miss Marple. "Too sweet, too innocent for such a thing. I cannot believe anyone in this house could have done such a thing." Her eyes moved from one face to another, her gaze pleading for understanding, her heart desperate to believe in the good in those closest to her. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind remained sharp. There was no mistaking Mrs. Bennet's genuine grief, but it was clear that the mother's sorrow was tinged with something else, something Miss Marple had come to recognize in many similar situations. The instinct to protect those closest to her, to shield them from suspicion. In the midst of her mourning, Mrs. Bennet seemed determined to dismiss the possibility that someone in the house might be involved in her daughter's death. Thomas, the elder son, was the next to speak. He sat stiffly on a nearby armchair, his face contorted with grief, but there was something in his posture, something in the tightness of his jaw, that Miss Marple couldn't ignore. He was grieving, yes, but his grief was not untainted by bitterness. "Elizabeth was always the favourite," Thomas muttered under his breath, though loud enough for Miss Marple to hear. "It's no surprise that something like this happened. It was bound to happen, with the way Mother fussed over her. She never had any time for me, always so wrapped up in Elizabeth." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, noting the resentful tone in his voice. It wasn't uncommon for siblings to harbour feelings of jealousy, but Thomas's words seemed laced with something far deeper than sibling rivalry. There was an edge to his bitterness that suggested more than just a sense of neglect. It felt, Miss Marple thought, as though he were harboring a long-standing resentment, a feeling that had festered beneath the surface for years. Could it be that his feelings toward his sister had grown into something darker, something more dangerous? Charlotte, the younger daughter, sat in the corner of the room, her head bent low. Her eyes were red from crying, and her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, as though trying to hold herself together. She looked every bit the grieving sister, but Miss Marple's sharp eye noticed something else. There was an odd stillness in Charlotte's demeanour, a restraint that didn't quite match the depth of her apparent grief. Miss Marple watched her closely, the quiet, almost imperceptible tension in her movements, speaking volumes. Charlotte had always been the quieter one, living in the shadow of Elizabeth's more outgoing, radiant personality. Elizabeth had been the centre of attention in their family, and it was clear that Charlotte had always struggled to find her own place in that dynamic. Now, as she looked up briefly from her hands, there was a strange glint in her eyes, something Miss Marple could not quite define. It wasn't the look of a heartbroken sister. No, this was something else. There was a flicker of resentment there, perhaps, and even more troubling, a quiet calculation, as though Charlotte were considering the situation with an eye to something beyond simple sorrow. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, analysing the subtle expressions, the fleeting glances, the smallest of gestures that others might have missed. It was clear to her that each of the Bennet family members, while outwardly devastated, held within them secrets that had likely been simmering beneath the surface long before Elizabeth's death. And in every family, she knew, there were dynamics that could lead to things far more complicated than mere sorrow. Her gaze flicked between the three of them. Mrs. Bennet, the mother desperate to hold on to a belief that no one in her family could have caused harm. Thomas, the older son, whose bitterness toward his sister had undoubtedly simmered for years, and Charlotte, whose grief seemed not to quite match the intensity one might expect, whose eyes betrayed something far more complex than sorrow. Miss Marple took another moment to study them, then spoke softly, her voice calm but firm. It is, of course, natural to feel grief after such a loss. But I must ask you all to consider, was Elizabeth's life so perfect? Was there something, perhaps, beneath the surface that we have yet to understand? Her words hung in the air, and Miss Marple could see the tension in the room thicken. Each of the Bennets reacted differently. Mrs. Bennet's eyes widened in alarm, as though she hadn't considered such a question before. Thomas stiffened, his jaw tightening further. Charlotte's hands twisted slightly in her lap, her gaze darting away. There was more to this family, Miss Marple was certain of it. Each thread of their emotions wove a complicated web, and it was within this web that Elizabeth's death had been spun. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in the details, and Miss Marple intended to find it. Chapter 5. The Poisoned Rose. The days following Elizabeth Bennet's death passed with a strange kind of inevitability. The village of St. Mary Mead, though small and unassuming, was filled with quiet whispers, all of which seemed to circle back to Oakwood Manor. Miss Marple, though her presence in the investigation had thus far been more one of quiet observation than overt action, knew that the time had come to turn her full attention to the matter at hand. The rose that had taken Elizabeth's life was, without question, the key to the mystery. Everything seemed to hinge upon it. With the help of the local authorities, Miss Marple had arranged for the petals of the poisoned rose to be carefully analysed. The results came back with chilling clarity. The substance found on the petals was a rare poison, one that was not easily obtainable, and one that required knowledge and access to specific chemicals. This was no accident. The poison had been deliberately applied to the flower, and the circumstances of Elizabeth's death were no longer a mere tragedy. They were the result of someone with both means and intent. The local constable, a sturdy and earnest man named Inspector Richards, confirmed that the substance found on the petals was a chemical that could only be procured through certain specialized suppliers, vendors of rare agricultural chemicals, or perhaps even a well-stocked apothecary's shop. Such chemicals were not available at the corner store, nor were they the kind of thing one could easily acquire without questions being asked. Who could have known about such a substance? Miss Marple asked herself as she reviewed the results with the inspector. And who had access to it? Her thoughts immediately turned to the people closest to Elizabeth. The first person that came to mind was Mr. Alastair James, the gardener. He had worked at Oakwood Manor for many years, and his access to the garden and to any chemicals used in its upkeep was unquestionable. After all, the roses had been his responsibility, and it was he who had tended to them with the kind of meticulous care that had earned the garden its reputation. Miss Marple recalled her earlier conversation with Mr. James. His nervous demeanour had struck her as odd, but she had not yet pressed him too far. Now, with this new information in hand, she felt certain that he needed to be questioned more thoroughly. It wasn't just the gardener, however, that Miss Marple considered. Mrs. Bennet, too, had access to the garden's tools and chemicals. Miss Marple knew that the proud matron of Oakwood Manor was deeply invested in the health of her roses, and it would not be beyond her to keep a close eye on the chemicals used to maintain them. But could Mrs. Bennet have done such a thing? She was, after all, deeply distraught over the loss of her daughter. Could the mother's grief be so consuming that it blinded her to the possibility of her own involvement? Miss Marple turned these questions over in her mind, letting them settle into place. Of course, there was the more obvious answer, the one that most people would dismiss out of hand. Could it have been someone else in the family? Could one of Elizabeth's siblings perhaps have laced the rose with poison? Thomas, the elder son, had already shown signs of bitterness toward his sister. His resentful mutterings about Elizabeth always being the favourite had not gone unnoticed by Miss Marple. Perhaps his jealousy had grown into something more dangerous. Charlotte, the younger daughter, had seemed the most heartbroken, but Miss Marple had not failed to note the strange, almost coldness in her demeanour. It was almost as if Charlotte was mourning not only the loss of her sister, but the loss of a role she had always been forced to play in her sister's shadow. Yes, Miss Marple mused, it could very well be that the death of Elizabeth Bennet was not only the result of personal animosity, but of a jealousy that ran much deeper than most would ever have imagined. Miss Marple turned once more to the flower that had caused Elizabeth's death. She had spent some time in the garden, inspecting the rosebed with the meticulous care she had learned to give to all such puzzles. The flower that Elizabeth had held so close to her chest was no accident. It had been deliberately chosen. The darkened petals, the thicker bloom, it had all been arranged as if to ensnare. Her fingers lingered over the thought as she recalled her conversation with the gardener. James had seemed so eager to dismiss any suspicion when questioned about the roses. "Nature sometimes does things we cannot control," he had said, an odd phrasing that echoed in Miss Marple's mind. She had not forgotten the fleeting nervousness in his eyes. And then there was Mrs. Bennet, who had placed such a heavy emphasis on the beauty of the roses, who had poured her love into the garden with the kind of devotion that could verge on obsession. Had she been too protective of her daughter to see the danger lurking so close? Miss Marple's mind ticked away in the quiet of the garden. The evidence was building, but there was still something she needed, a connection. There was no doubt that the poison had been placed with intent, but who was the true culprit? She knew, as she stood in the fragrant garden, that the answer would lie in the smallest of details, one clue that had eluded everyone else. The final piece of the puzzle was waiting to be discovered. Miss Marple would not rest until it was found. As she left the garden to rejoin the family, she made a mental note to speak to each of them once more. There was still much to be learned from their reactions, and perhaps, just perhaps, one of them would reveal more than they intended. Chapter 6. Secrets Revealed and the Truth Unveiled. The family had gathered once again in the sitting room of Oakwood Manor, their faces drawn, the air thick with grief and confusion. Miss Marple had visited each of them privately, carefully listening, observing, and piecing together the small details they had let slip, often unintentionally. Though their grief was genuine, Miss Marple had learned long ago that the true nature of a mystery was often hidden beneath the surface, within the small inconsistencies, the subtle changes in behavior that others overlooked. And it was within these inconsistencies that the answers to Elizabeth's death lay. The calm exterior of Oakwood Manor could not mask the tension inside. The family, once close-knit and united, had been torn apart by the tragedy that had struck them so suddenly. Elizabeth Bennet's death had left an indelible scar, one that would never heal. Miss Marple had already spoken to Mrs. Bennet, whose sorrow seemed almost too great to bear. Her grief was raw, and yet Miss Marple couldn't help but notice how quick Mrs. Bennet had been to dismiss the possibility of anyone within the family being involved. It was as if she clung to the belief that Elizabeth's death had to be an accident, a cruel twist of fate. But Miss Marple knew that sometimes the most painful truths were the ones we refused to acknowledge. Her focus shifted next to Charlotte, the youngest of the Bennet children. Since Elizabeth's death, Charlotte had become quieter and more withdrawn, her usual shy demeanor now more pronounced. She rarely spoke, keeping to herself in the corner of the room. Miss Marple found this odd. Was it grief that had silenced her, or something else? When Miss Marple had asked Charlotte about the roses, she had observed her carefully. Charlotte's reaction was telling. Her eyes had darted away nervously, a subtle shift in posture that suggested she was hiding something. Lizzie always loved the roses, Charlotte had said, her voice trembling as she spoke. She was the one who always spent time in the garden. I never thought she'd... Charlotte's voice faltered and she trailed off, her gaze averted, her fingers nervously twisting together. Miss Marple had noticed the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes avoided meeting hers. Something about her reaction didn't sit right with Miss Marple. It wasn't just grief that had caused Charlotte's sudden silence. It was guilt. Miss Marple had known from that moment that Charlotte had been hiding something. The young woman's jealousy of her sister's beauty, the attention Elizabeth received from both her family and others, had been a constant undercurrent in their relationship. But it wasn't just her sister's popularity that had triggered Charlotte's resentment. Miss Marple recalled the day when Thomas, the elder son, had complimented Elizabeth on her beauty just a few days before the tragedy. Charlotte had been there, and Miss Marple could only imagine how the moment had festered in Charlotte's mind. The thought of Elizabeth becoming the center of attention, of being the one to receive love and admiration, had driven Charlotte to madness. Miss Marple knew then that jealousy, though often concealed behind a smile, could be a far more dangerous emotion than most people realized. The sitting room had grown colder as the evening stretched on, and Miss Marple, having gathered all the pieces, stood before the Bennet family once more. The weight of what she had uncovered was heavy, and though her expression remained serene, there was a quiet intensity in her eyes. She had the truth. Now it was time to reveal it. Mrs. Bennet sat at the edge of her seat, her hands trembling in her lap, eyes wide with expectation. She had asked Miss Marple, with an almost desperate urgency, who could have possibly harmed her daughter. The question echoed in the room, a piercing cry of anguish that no mother should ever have to ask. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Bennet said, her voice barely a whisper, "who could have done such a thing to my Elizabeth?" Miss Marple looked directly at Mrs. Bennet, her voice soft but firm. "Sadly, it was your own daughter, Charlotte," she said, her words cutting through the air with an almost chilling finality. The room fell into stunned silence. Mrs. Bennet's face drained of colour, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Thomas, who had been standing near the fire, froze, his face pale with shock. The weight of Miss Marple's words hung heavily in the room, suffocating all else. Charlotte stood motionless, her pale face locked in an expression of terror, as though she had been struck dumb by the truth. Her body trembled as she looked from one face to another, the weight of her guilt settling in like a leaden burden. She had confessed, and yet the truth still felt too much to bear. Miss Marple continued, her voice unwavering. "You see, Charlotte was jealous of her sister's beauty and the love she received from her family, particularly from Thomas. It was this jealousy, this envy of the attention Elizabeth always seemed to garner, that led Charlotte to poison the very rose Elizabeth adored." Charlotte's expression crumpled, and she collapsed into the chair, her sobs racking her body. "I never meant for it to happen. I didn't want to kill her," she sobbed, her voice thick with regret. "I just wanted to be seen, just once, just for someone to notice me." Her words, though sincere, were no comfort to the family. The damage had been done. The truth, as it so often does, had brought more pain than anyone could have anticipated. Miss Marple's eyes softened with sympathy, but she knew there was no easy way to undo the harm that had been caused. The family sat in stunned silence, their grief deepened not only by the loss of Elizabeth, but by the revelation that the one who had taken her from them was their own flesh and blood. The quiet, unspoken jealousy that had festered within Charlotte had led to an irreversible act, one that could never be undone. Miss Marple stood for a moment observing the family, before she quietly stepped towards the door. "It is always the ones closest to us, the ones we least suspect, who harbour the deepest secrets," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "Jealousy, like poison, can infect even the purest hearts." And with that, Miss Marple left Oakwood Manor, knowing that the village would never be the same. But she also knew that in the end, justice had been served, as quietly and inevitably as the turning of the season. Chapter 7. A Bitter End. The sitting room of Oakwood Manor was eerily still, save for the occasional sniffle from Mrs. Bennet and the soft, shuffling movements of the constable as he made preparations to escort Charlotte from the room. The confession had been made. Charlotte Bennet, the younger daughter, stood at the heart of a tragedy so deep and incomprehensible that the family could scarcely comprehend it. Her sobs had long since subsided into a trembling silence, but her guilt lingered in the air like a palpable fog. Miss Marple's words, though spoken with quiet gentleness, had brought the truth crashing down upon them all. The eldest son, Thomas, was the first to speak after the shock had settled into the deepest recesses of his heart. "Why, Charlotte?" His voice was hoarse, strained with disbelief, as he turned towards his younger sister. "Why would you do such a thing? You of all people." Charlotte's eyes, red and swollen from weeping, were fixed on the floor. She didn't respond. There was nothing more to say, not after the weight of her confession had already broken the delicate fabric of their family. Mrs. Bennet, unable to tear her gaze away from her daughter, reached out a trembling hand but pulled it back, as though she were afraid to touch the reality of what had just been unveiled. Miss Marple, ever composed, observed the scene with a quiet sadness. The room, which had once been a sanctuary of warmth, now felt as though it were closing in on itself, the shadows lengthening in the corners. The family was fractured, its foundation shattered by the very thing that had once bound them together, love. And now that love had turned to ashes, tainted by jealousy, the most insidious of emotions. As the constable gently placed his hand on Charlotte's shoulder, guiding her toward the door, Mrs. Bennet's sobs filled the silence, a raw and heart-wrenching sound that seemed to echo in the stillness of the room. Thomas, too, stood frozen, his face pale with the shock of it all. He had loved his sister in his own way, despite the underlying tensions, and yet, now that love seemed hollow, tainted by the ugly truth of her actions. The constable's voice, firm but kind, cut through the heavy air. "Come now, Miss Charlotte, it's time." Charlotte stood motionless for a moment, as though she, too, was struggling to grasp the enormity of what had occurred. She looked back once, her eyes meeting her mother's. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible before she was led out of the room, her shoulders hunched in defeat. The door clicked softly behind her, and the room was left in a heavy, aching silence. Miss Marple, having observed the painful scene unfold, allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had long known that the most dangerous secrets were those held by the ones closest to us. It was often the people we loved, the ones we thought we knew best, who were capable of the most profound betrayals. Miss Marple turned toward Mrs. Bennet, who was still seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she fought to control the sobs that racked her body. "It is always the ones closest to us, the ones we least suspect, who harbour the deepest secrets," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice soft but filled with the weight of truth. "Jealousy, like poison, can infect even the purest hearts." The words hung in the air, but Mrs. Bennet did not respond. There was nothing more to be said. The bitter truth had been laid bare, and the cost had been more than anyone could bear. Elizabeth was gone, and Charlotte, in her envy, had destroyed not only her sister's life, but her own. Miss Marple took a step toward the door, her hand resting lightly on the handle. She had done what she could, bringing justice to a situation that had seemed so inexplicable in the beginning. The pieces had come together, as they always did, in their own time, but the cost of that knowledge had been great. As she paused in the doorway, Miss Marple glanced back one last time at the family she had come to know so well. Mrs. Bennet, in her grief, was lost to the world, Thomas standing in the shadows, his face hidden behind a mask of sorrow. There was nothing left for Miss Marple to do here but to leave them to their mourning and their shame. With a soft sigh, Miss Marple stepped out of the room and into the quiet hallway beyond. She knew the village of St. Mary Mead would never be the same. Oakwood Manor, once a place of family and warmth, would now carry the burden of its own dark secret. But justice, in its own quiet, inevitable way, had been served. And as Miss Marple walked down the long corridor and out into the evening light, she could not help but reflect on the cruel power of jealousy, a force that could tear families apart and turn love into something poisonous. It had been a bitter end, but it was an end nonetheless. And with that, Miss Marple knew her work was done.